very much for inviting me today to speak. And basically, I wanted to present some of the preliminary findings from research I've been doing at the Tufts University for the last year or so. And basically, it's an aid effectiveness study, but coming out of the belief that the aid effectiveness discussion has been far too limited to aid's effectiveness in achieving humanitarian and development objectives, but very little focus on the effectiveness of aid at achieving political or security objectives. And with more and more of U.S. aid now being programmed to achieve stabilization, security objectives, there's remarkably little evidence to actually show its effectiveness in this area. So that's been the objective of the study. Sorry, I'm a bit of a Luddite, so if someone can tell me the...
Yes, the next one.
Oh, yeah.
Click left, please.
Just click anywhere, just and then.
Okay. Okay, we'll get there eventually. Here I just have some quotes to give a sense of the assumption that we'll be discussing today. Very frequently stated in aid and security and development are two sides of the same coin. In the Afghan context, then General, current Ambassador Eikenberry quite famously said, where the road ends, the Taliban begins. One of my favorites is former Senator Biden, when he came back from Afghanistan about a year and a half ago, very enthusiastically in a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, it's all about asphalt. If we can get more asphalt down. Just a couple weeks ago, there's a bit of a controversy in Canada after an event in Kandahar, and the Canadian Defense Minister came out very explicitly in terms of this assumption. In April of this year, the Army actually came out with a handbook called the Commander's Guide to Money as a Weapon System in terms of how do we use money to win hearts and minds and promote stabilization. And this assumption, to some extent, is accepted somewhat uncritically, that there is this causal relationship, and that these are complementary objectives, development and stability, and not really questioning it. Maybe actually they're contradictory, or maybe they're actually not related at all. So that's basically what the research has been looking at. But I wanted to emphasize this is not just an assumption that the military has. This is a strong assumption of many development actors as well. So here's a quote from Oxfam, one of the preeminent development agencies that's been working in Afghanistan for years. But again, just showing also the assumption often amongst development actors of that link: poverty, fuels insecurity. It's an essential long-term means of reducing vulnerability to the spread of militancy development. So again, I'm not coming at this from the military shouldn't do development line. This is not a humanitarian principles-based argument that we're researching. It's very much looking at effectiveness of aid. And that assumption is held, again, by military, but also by development actors working in Afghanistan. The assumption has had a very major policy impact. First of all, lots more money for reconstruction and development. And cynics might argue this is one reason why the development community likes the assumption, because there's been a tremendous increase in funding, the largest increase since our Cold War days of U.S. government funding for development, to a significant extent because of this assumption. But it also means that an increasing percentage of our development assistance is being programmed now to achieve security objectives rather than more traditional, say, humanitarian and development objectives. So, for example, you see this globally, of course, where I think about 50% of USAID's funding basically goes to 5 countries in the world now: Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. But then even within Afghanistan, we don't have the latest figures, but up in 2007, the NGO coordinating body in Afghanistan published a study showing that more than 50% of USAID's funding in Afghanistan was being spent in only 4 out of 34 provinces in Afghanistan, and those 4, of course, being in the south, where we were fighting the insurgency. And between 2002 and 2007, more money was spent in Helmand province alone in the south by the US government than all of northern Afghanistan combined. So again, this assumption is having very big impact on where the money is being spent, which of course in Afghanistan leads to many complaints by those people living in secure areas as to why are we being penalized, that we're creating in a way these perverse incentives of rewarding insecure areas with lots of development money and penalizing the secure areas because they're secure. So if you don't grow poppies in Afghanistan and you don't have Taliban, you're in bad shape in terms of development programming, certainly from the US government's perspective. And the indications are that the latest McChrystal report, which was leaked from that, is that this trend is going to be increased even more. It comes out very clearly in that report that we want to increase our resources into the most insecure areas. So again, I think we're going to see this trend continuing. I think the third impact is, again, the growing role of the military as a development actor. And you see this very much by the budgets. The Commander's Emergency Response Budget, which is the main funding mechanism for, say, the military's Hearts and Minds projects, has increased dramatically in the past few years. And next year is projected to nearly double from this year's funding to $1.2 billion. And I've not had it confirmed, but I've heard that this year's figure of 700 million, of that, they could not even spend the military could not spend 300 million due to sort of absorptive issues. And so 1.2 billion is a lot of money in the Afghan context for development programs. But also globally, we don't have the latest figures, but the OECD DAC figures show a very significant increase in the DoD's percentage of the official development assistance of the US. It went from 6% in 2002 up to 22% in 2005. And USAID's shrunk from about 50% down to 39%. So again, DoD is becoming a very, very major development actor. But in terms of our research, there's a lot of questions about the assumption that I wanted to sort of go over a bit today. First of all, poverty and lack of reconstruction are significant causes of conflict and the insurgency. That's a major assumption underlying this policy. Which I believe lacks evidence. This assumption sort of this linear causal relationship between aid, economic development, and stability, which lacks evidence. Aid projects make you popular. They win hearts and minds. There's little evidence. And then the very fundamental assumption of extending the reach of the central government contributes to stabilization. And this I put down because this is actually the main objective of the military's provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan. In terms of the evidence, I just wanted to go over various areas where I think that it's not there, starting with the historical evidence. You could look at Afghanistan's history and conclude that it's basically been the efforts to modernize and develop Afghanistan which have been the major causes of instability in Afghanistan. If you look at the period of King Amanullah from 1919 to 1929, he basically instituted a Ataturk-style sort of modernization agenda, and many historians believe that's in a way some of the social forces that unleashed contributed to his overthrow. And I came across a USAID document recently, which I just wanted to go over some findings from. And if you'll bear with me, because I'm going to do what you're absolutely not meant to do in a PowerPoint presentation. It's far too much text. But I do think there is a punchline, and I think it's important to look at some of the lessons that this USAID report has come up with. Number one, talking about the human resource constraints that have really undermined the various development efforts in Afghanistan. Secondly, the highly disappointing results of public administration reform or civil service reform efforts. The efforts to try to reform the Afghan government have largely been unsuccessful, according to this study. Again, the assumption that economic development is a panacea really has not proved to be the case. High turnover. It's been a big problem in the aid mission. Again, the ability of Afghan officials were highly skilled at negotiating their way around difficult reform issues. So the difficulty of pushing a reform agenda in that context was highlighted. And then the idea that the U.S. generally had too much confidence in the applicability of technical solutions to complex social and economic development problems, and of the appropriateness and transferability of U.S. values and experience. And the reason I've gone on, this report is interesting because it was actually written 20 years ago. It was written in 1989. A USAID project officer in Islamabad contracted some consultants to do a study of the lessons learned from the massive US aid programs in Afghanistan from 1950 to 1979. And it's important to remember that that period, in the 60s and 70s, Afghanistan was one of the largest per capita recipients of foreign aid in the world. So this is not the first time Afghanistan has been a big recipient of foreign aid. But it's a good example of how lessons aren't learned. You can have your lessons, but these are exactly the same issues I think are really undermining a lot of the development efforts today. But the conclusion of that report was the use of aid for short-term political objectives and the competition with the Soviet Union tended to distort sound economic rationale for development, and in the process to weaken the long-term political interests of the U.S. Aid as a tool of diplomacy has its limitations when politically motivated commitments are at much higher levels and promise more than can reasonably be delivered in economic returns. So again, sorry to belabor the point, but I think it is very important to actually look back at the experience of the past, where we did have a massive aid program trying to win hearts and minds in the Cold War battle in the 60s and 70s in Afghanistan, and clearly with limited results. One area which I think has been understudied is the Soviet experience in Afghanistan in the 80s. Most of what's been written has been very much looking at sort of combat operations, sort of a military analysis of the Soviet experience, and not too much in terms of their massive aid and development programs. And we're beginning to see some attention at that. And there's a professor at the University of Ottawa, Paul Robinson, who's just about to come out with a book looking at the Soviet experience, which is very interesting because they had thousands of economic advisors in Afghanistan, largely overseeing lots of infrastructure programs, construction projects. And when we're talking about our civilian surge, I think it would be useful to learn a bit more from that experience. And again, he also concludes that that their hearts and minds operations did not achieve much in the way of success. It's hard to look back at that period and see that these massive investments in infrastructure in particular had significant security returns in terms of stabilization. So again, a fairly consistent finding looking back historically is that aid in Afghanistan has not really had significant stabilization benefits. You can also go on and look at in terms of correlation between poverty and insecurity. And again, little evidence. If you take a poverty map of Afghanistan, and again, data in Afghanistan is highly dubious and is suspect, so you need to treat it all with great caution. But generally, there's not a lot of correlation between the poorest areas of Afghanistan and the most insecure areas. And in fact, the most poor areas, say in central Hazarajat or northeast Badakhshan, are amongst the most secure areas. And again, we have this evidence from elsewhere in terms of research that there's not necessarily a correlation, and yet somehow in this assumption, which is now so central to our counterinsurgency doctrine, it seems to be taken without much questioning. There was a report that just came out actually a few weeks ago that the British government had contracted an organization to do that, looking at drivers of radicalization in Afghanistan. And one of the hypotheses they were meant to look at was this assumption that the government failure to provide basic services allows extremist groups to meet these needs and build support as a result. And the evidence from this very interesting report also basically found that it does not support this hypothesis. Basically looking at the research that didn't really come up, the issue of social service delivery did not feature very much at all as a driver of radicalization in the Afghan context. And to some extent, it shouldn't be surprising. I mean, the Afghan state has never really derived its legitimacy by delivering social services. And so why we should assume now that the delivery of social services is going to be a key factor in legitimizing the state, I think it's debatable. And of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't be delivering social services, but I am saying that we shouldn't assume that delivery of social services is going to have a significant stabilization benefit in the Afghan context. Because, of course, the Taliban don't offer, their sales pitch doesn't include delivery of massive reconstruction and social services. It's basically security and justice is what they claim to be offering, and not, again, social services. Okay, now I seem to... This always happens to me. Okay, I now want to just go on and present some of the actual preliminary findings from the research work we've been doing. The study has been looking in 5 provinces of Afghanistan, using primarily qualitative research methods, interviewing over the past year. There's been about 4 researchers leading the research, trying to get what are perceptions of aid, security, linkages between the two at the local level. What do people perceive are the causes of insecurity? And in that area, I should point out this, I was just in Rosgan province in the south in June and July, and this was a poster at the Dutch led PRT, where they had a $7,500 project to go out there and win hearts and minds. It seemed by distributing pencils, but the kids seem happy. So these are the major causes of insecurity that have come out of our research in these provinces. Number 1 cause of perceived insecurity is the Afghan government, and the sense of a growing distance between the people and the government. And I was interviewing in January some elders in Paktia province in the southeast, and one of the elders there said, Paktia has lots of problems, but the issue of lack of clinics, schools, and roads are not the problem. The main problem is we don't have a good government. Without a clean government, millions of dollars are stolen. If you increase the amount of money, it will also be useless because the government will simply steal more. There's a growing distance between the people and the government, and this is the main cause of the deteriorating security situation. So again, this came out very consistently in a lot of our research in the South, that the government was being blamed and again, for a lot of the problems. And in particular, corruption issues around perceptions of the predatory nature of the Afghan National Police in many cases, and again, a whole litany of complaints that were viewed to be contributing to the insecurity amongst local communities. The second one was basically the international military operations and the perceived lack of respect for local culture, religion, and traditions. And a lot of this related in particular to special forces operations or civilian casualties due to some of the bombings, or the detention policies. Lots of people had relatives or had been arrested or sent to Bagram Air Base, some to Guantanamo. And so again, some of the negative perceptions that came out of that. Again, some commander I spoke to down in Paktia, the mistakes of the coalition are why aid projects have no benefit. When they bomb, kill innocent civilians, use dogs to search our houses and women, and even harm women and children, how can they expect people to support them? And this came out very strongly, especially again down in the southeast and southern provinces. One of them described the PRTs, again, the provincial reconstruction teams, as milk cows. Says, we get a lot of good things out of this cow. They get us lots of projects, but then one of these, civilian casualty incidents or a special forces operation that goes bad, whatever, it's like the cow kicking over the milk, the bucket full of milk. I mean, it's all for naught due to some of those operations. Pakistan, neighboring countries, most, and Pakistan of course is the one mentioned the most, but also to some extent Iran was as a major perceived cause of insecurity. Unemployment came up in a lot of the interviews, and again this is the one cause that could be related to the issue of reconstruction and development, which is one of the areas we'd like to actually do more research in, because of course there's lots of unemployed and underemployed Afghans who don't join the Taliban. So why is it that, I mean, there's this idea of the $10 a day Talib, that lots of Talibs are joining because they can earn money. It's a livelihood strategy. But there's actually, again, not a whole strong evidence base for how strong that phenomenon is, or, you know, and I'm personally a little skeptical that it's as important as we're attributing it to. If money were really driving the insurgency, you know, you could pay someone $10 a day to work on a road project, but if someone comes along and offers you $500 a day to lay an IED in the road, you know, what's to stop that? But this is an area we're trying to get a better sense of to what extent this $10 a day Talib phenomenon is as important as is being assumed. Ethnicity came out very strongly, certainly down in the Pashtun areas, the perception of overall Pashtun disempowerment, and that minority groups had gained too much power, especially in terms of the security forces in Afghanistan, a perception that the police were heavily dominated by Tajiks in particular. ANA officer corps was heavily dominated by non-Pashtun. The National Security Department, the intelligence agency, was dominated by Northern Alliance. And that was a major cause of grievance. Of course, in the research in the north, it's the perception that the Pashtun are still too powerful. So again, but this ethnicity, I think, is one of the important factors. Inter and intra-tribal disputes is a very big factor. In Paktia province, again, where I was, in some of the districts that are relatively homogenous tribally, they had a lot less insurgent activity than when you had much more fragmented tribal groups. And not surprisingly, one group gets patronage from government, and so a rival group then goes to the Taliban to get power in terms of their local tribal disputes. The Taliban were identified as a cause of insecurity, but often quite far down the list. And then there's many other factors, and including amongst them democracy. And I talked about this a couple weeks ago here in the context of elections. But in a way, the perception of many Afghans that democracy are fueling anarchy, and it's contributing to insecurity. In terms of perceptions of aid, this is where I think I'm always very surprised at this assumption that aid projects win hearts and minds and make people happy. I mean, I've been a development worker for most of my professional life, and it's not a field you should get into if you really want to become popular, because I mean, aid generally, you know, often pisses people off. And in the Afghan context, I mean, I think if you look at the aid dynamics, you know, aid actors are generally very unpopular in the Afghan context. And that applies to NGOs, that applies to aid contractors, that applies to the military, that applies to the government. You go into these communities and you ask about their perceptions, and you get a long litany of complaints about how bad aid actors are and how bad the aid work is. And it's, you know, the first one is that nothing has been done. And it's very common to go down, you know, a brand new $100 million road with your Roshan telephone service working most of that time. But you get to Gardez, and the streets of Gardez are now paved. You have a new hospital, you have clinics and schools. So clearly lots has been done, but it's very common for this perception that nothing has been done or not enough has been done, which raises serious questions about expectations. I mean, how much do you actually have to do to start winning hearts and minds? How much is enough? Because again, there's lots to complain about in terms of the quality of aid and what's been done. A lot of mistakes have been made, but also lots of very good development work has been done in Afghanistan in the last 7 or 8 years. And there are some real notable success stories. And you know, we talked last week about the health sector. I think that Afghanistan probably has a better health sector today than ever before in Afghanistan's history. But that doesn't mean that most Afghans are really happy with their health system. Oops. The other thing is the zero-sum game, which is a very important factor in Afghanistan. You build something in one village, 10 other villages are unhappy because they didn't get it. And in this assumption, one person's gain is other people's loss. And this has come out in a lot of the resources, a lot of the interviews, the perception that they got more than we did. A couple of years ago, the PRT and Khost spent lots of money on roads and reconstruction projects. And so when I was doing research in the neighboring province of Paktia, everyone was talking about how much money Khost got in comparison to what they got. But last year's PRT this last PRT in Gardez had a budget of about $60 million. And in addition to that, USAID was spending about that amount more on their own program. So it's not a small amount of aid being spent in this one province of Afghanistan, but again, the perception that others got more than they did. Lots of complaints about corruption. Everyone's corrupt, everyone's on the take. The poor quality of projects came up frequently, and it's quite easy to see quite a bit of that. Schools or clinics that were built fairly recently are crumbling. Roads last a year. Complaints about inappropriate projects. A lot of people want big infrastructure projects. They say, why are you doing these small irrigation projects? We want a dam, we want a factory. Even if there's nothing for the factories to really produce, that would make sense, but there's a real belief in a desire for these large infrastructure projects. Again, money wasted, lots of broken promises. This is a problem because often PRTs will come in and on relatively short tours, they'll go identify a project that they feel is important to do. A project will be designed, but if they rotate out before it's actually completely gone through the system, the next PRT commander coming in might have a different set of priorities. And it's easy for expectations to be raised and then priorities to change and those projects not to be done. And perceptions of little consultation was quite a common complaint. Again, the point being is that you rarely in these interviews have someone tell you how grateful they are for all the wonderful things that have been done. And in some cases wonderful things have been done, but I think we should definitely be questioning this assumption that aid projects win hearts and minds and make people want to be loyal to either supportive of international forces, but also more importantly, their government. And I did want to mention that, again, in the research there were, you do hear, the one project we did hear consistently better things about was the National Solidarity Program. And some of you might be familiar with that, but that's basically a project that run through the international donors fund the Ministry of Rural Reconstruction and Development, which then contracts out to contractors or NGOs to implement small-scale infrastructure projects. But there's quite a process that goes along with it. You go into a community, you help organize these community development committees, elections are held for those, these committees then try to prioritize what projects are needed in their community. It's a relatively small block grant is put forward of approximately $27,000. And then the communities are actually involved in the implementation. And to some extent, for anyone who's been an aid worker, it's sort of, community development 101. Seems to work better than some of the other approaches. So, but that's the one project we heard relatively positive things about. However, that didn't necessarily get translated into positive perceptions of the government. In fact, rarely did it. And that's one of the issues we don't fully understand. But the fact that people like the project does not translate into that makes us now like the government, or even the aid agencies implementing the project. In a lot of our interviews with people, primarily in the PRTs and some of the military and embassy officials in Kabul, we did get some indications that aid projects had potential for stabilization benefit. And I think the most important one is an aid project can legitimize interaction. So for a PRT commander who goes out to the field, I think under the guise of talking about what are the community's priorities that we want to help address, you can form relationships and get to know some of the key community elders. However, that potential is rarely realized because, again, of the high, the U.S. PRT generally, I think, have a 9-month rotation cycle, but most of the Europeans are significantly shorter. And the idea, there's, I think, a potential in there to develop a relationship, but rarely is that realized because people rotate out. And the transition between PRTs is still, I think, not terribly good. There have been some reported intelligence gathering benefits from some of these projects, but because I'm not privy to those, it's hard for me to determine how significant they are. From people who I've talked to who have seen it, it's, again, there has been some, but I don't think it's been, in terms of, say, people reporting IEDs. But clearly, if you look at the dramatic increase in IEDs in the last year in Afghanistan, it doesn't seem to be having a decisive impact in that area. And there are some indications that in terms of very sort of micro-level disputes, very well-conceived community development program, say if there's a dispute over water resources, you could maybe have a SMART project that could help mitigate conflict between these two communities. But this is at a very micro level and not necessarily insurgency-related violence, which is why we're spending a lot of this money. And the thing which is actually coming out of the research, which I'm hoping now to pursue in our next phase in more depth, is not only is aid doesn't appear to be stabilizing, but there's considerable evidence that aid is quite destabilizing. And I think this is an area that really, again, requires quite a bit more thought by key policymakers, because again, it's to some extent blindly assumed that spending more aid money somehow has these magical positive consequences, but we're not adequately understanding the negative consequences. And just to touch on a few, you're hearing anecdotal reports of conflict between some of the construction companies. The stakes are high. Hundreds of millions of dollars are now being spent on, say, road building projects in particular, but lots of other construction infrastructure. So I've heard reports of some construction companies, basically paying Taliban to threaten a rival company to pull out of an area so that they can then get the contract, or about, one person underbidding an influential person with links high up in the government and was basically told to withdraw his bid, and when he didn't, he was basically killed. And so again, there's that kind of sort of mafia-like sort of political economy of aid in the construction sector at work. But more significantly, I think, is again this issue of winners and losers. And I think that's where, I was in Rozgan province this summer doing research, and there was a perception that a lot of the aid basically went to one faction, closely linked, not coincidentally, the president's tribe was the key player, and they were one amongst many tribes in the province and were perceived to be getting a disproportionate percentage of the political positions, the security contracting, and the aid contracting. And one of the people I spoke to there said, in this area, the family and friends of Karzai get everything. All aid in these areas is to make them more powerful. They are corrupt and cruel people, but donors continue to support them. And not surprisingly, then the rival tribes now are going to the Taliban to get their support to strengthen their tribal position relative to the Popolzai tribe, which is the president's tribe. So again, those kind of aid dynamics, aid is strengthening some factions at the expense of others, or at least being perceived to. There's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence, and we're beginning to see the first, I think, good reporting on this about that aid revenues are a significant portion of Taliban revenues, and that quite a few, if you're a construction company wins a contract to build a highway through a Taliban-influenced area, it's not surprising that these people basically pay off the Taliban not to shoot them as they build their road to these projects. And again, it's hard to get a sense of the extent of this, but it's come up in quite a few of the interviews, and as I said, quite a bit of reporting is being done on those just in the last month. And again, to quote one of the people we talked to, there are only two ways to get projects implemented in insecure areas. You either directly pay the Taliban or you bribe the government to provide security. And Time magazine had a good quote about one Afghan contractor speaking privately, told friends of one project he was overseeing in the volatile south. "I was building a bridge," he said one evening over drinks. "The local Taliban commander called and said, 'Don't build a bridge there, we'll have to blow it up.' I asked him to let me finish the bridge, collect the money, then they could blow it up whenever they wanted. We agreed and I completed my project." But again, anecdotal, I fully admit, but I would be surprised, given the hundreds of millions of dollars now being spent on these projects, that this isn't a significant problem and that a significant amounts of money are not ending up in Taliban coffers from our aid budgets. It also creates not just incentives for the, and resources for the Taliban, but other sort of local warlords. We are actually paying quite a bit of money to illegal or semi-legal militia groups to provide security for some of these road building projects. And some fairly unsavory characters get a lot of money from us to basically provide protection for road construction. So in Rosgan province, there's one road that was being built. It was put out for tender, and I had heard that the amount being requested to provide security for the road by this one militia commander is $200,000 a month. Again, all these kind of figures are hard to verify, but just to give you a sense, I mean, it's significant amounts of money. And anecdotally again, the Dutch PRT officials were saying whenever it came time to renew contracts, the security situation mysteriously deteriorated until the new contract had been signed, and then everything was fine again. But the biggest issue, and I think the biggest cause of instability, is corruption. I think, not surprisingly, if you try to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in insecure areas with limited institutional capacity, limited human resource capacity, and very limited capacity to monitor, it fuels corruption. And everyone's getting hot and bothered about corruption in Afghanistan, and yet we don't go to the next step. And it's actually our money which is fueling lots of that corruption, because we don't demand. We're trying to spend too much, and we don't demand greater oversight. And in the context of some of these highly insecure southern provinces, it's not realistic to think that you can provide much oversight. So I would argue that a lot of our money is, again, fueling the corruption, which is delegitimizing the government, which I think is one of the major causes of instability in Afghanistan. Just one of the things I'm also interested in the next phase of looking at is the whole issue of roads and stabilization, because this is one of the largest amounts of dollars right now in terms of the PRTs and USAID budget, I think, is going to road building. Again, because of the assumption that roads contribute to stability. And there's differing perspectives of this. But we've spent, about $300 million in the Kabul-Kandahar highway, another $100 million on Costa Gardez. I mean, hundreds of millions on a lot of these roads. And none of them are safe enough for me to drive on. I think there is some very limited tactical benefits that a paved road is more difficult to lay an IED in. So I think at that level, you could argue that there's been some security benefits. But the idea that roads lead to economic development, which then leads to stability, is one of the, frequently comes up in the arguments. And again, I'd say, well, show me some evidence of where that's actually happened. And to date, no one has been able to show a concrete example of where one of these projects has actually had a significant stabilization benefit. And just lastly, before we go on some recommendations, is a lot of this hearts and minds thing I think is important, but I think in our research that's coming out, it's actually much more important for winning our hearts and minds than winning Afghan hearts and minds. At one level, I think it's good for troop morale, but more significantly, I think it's very important to be able to show the domestic audience that we're there doing state building, reconstruction, and development, And this is less true for the US but than for our European allies in Canada. And many of our NATO allies, their governments justified going to Afghanistan on the basis that there's a peacekeeping operation, nation-building activities, and they're still selling it to the domestic, increasingly skeptical domestic audiences on the basis that they're there doing all this wonderful reconstruction and development work. And so I think it does have an important political role to play in winning hearts and minds, but I think a lot of it's for domestic audiences. And in this picture, I think, whose heart do you think has really been won in terms of somewhat skeptical. But I think I'll leave it at that. I have some recommendations we can discuss in question and answer, but I think I've taken my allotted 40 minutes or whatever it was to begin. So over to you. Thank you very much.
So please go ahead and
Yeah, any.
select your
Matt, go for it.
having worked with Oxfam, I probably should say a few words about the Oxfam Perspective and how they see it. But I thought that was, and I really think that you've hit on many of the key issues, and I have to say that majority of that I agree with. I think we also cannot discount poverty as a potential factor that influences the vulnerability of people, and this is I don't think you're necessarily doing that. I think the questioning the capacity of aid to really win hearts and minds is absolutely the right thing, and we need to really understand the limitations of it. But just from the from the Oxfam perspective, again, it was a question of vulnerability, and I think the sort of feedback I was getting from staff there was, they were talking to people, and Oxfam used to work in the south and insecure areas, the southeast, that for the decision of the individual Talib who joins up, there's a context, an accumulation of different important factors, such as the existing mistrust towards foreign forces, the excessive use of force by international forces, the corruption and predation from the government, and then the coercion from the Talibs. And the current figures are on average every 3 days they execute two Afghans for their association with the government. So all of these factors, I think, come together. But I suppose the position of Oxfam was that poverty is just one additional factor that might, if an Afghan, and it's not, I think, there are many areas of the south that are not doing too badly, but within those areas there are those who are really, struggling. If somebody is unemployed, and the dishonour of not being able to feed the family, and is really on the edge, and I got that feedback from our staff that many of the people they were working with were really on the edge, and given the context, where actually, it's not it's a reasonable option to work with the insurgents, and they seem to be doing quite well. Poverty, real poverty might just push people to make that decision to work with, to join the insurgents. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying it's a major factor, but I think Oxfam's perception was it could increase vulnerability to joining the insurgents. And I just wanted to share. Just the research that has just been done by Oxfam. It'd be interesting to see how you interpret that and what your reaction is to that. That was in 14 provinces, 700 people, and it was very interesting. And again, it was a snapshot. It wasn't in-depth research like you've done. I think it's yours very high sort of level of sophistication in your research.
Yeah, don't exaggerate that, Simon.
But it was just with ordinary people. And this is several organisations that did this, and it asked about what do you think the main causes were of conflict over the last 30 years. It was really interesting. 70% said poverty and unemployment, and then after that the next highest was corruption and ineffectiveness of the government, 48%. And it's interesting to see that was what we were getting from the field, but Of course, maybe they suspected the connection to Oxfam and therefore it influenced their replies. But anyway, I just wanted to just throw that out there because I really do agree with the fundamental argument that you're making, but I just think we can't discount it as a factor. That's all.
Yeah, no, and I certainly wouldn't discount it as a factor. I think my point is I think its importance is exaggerated given the centrality of this assumption to our counterinsurgency strategy now. I would say there's room for caution that it might not be as effective as it is. And this, again, these very, I think, simplistic assumptions of causality need to be challenged more. You know, as I said, I think unemployment comes up in our interviews too as an issue. But how important amongst the issues, it's one amongst many issues that it appears. So I don't want to say that it's not a factor at all, but I think we are assuming in our current policy, it's one of the major driving assumptions. And again, I'm also certainly not saying we shouldn't be trying to alleviate poverty. I mean, I've again been a development worker most of my life. I think that that's a real important thing to do. And you know, as I have a recommendation here, we should, I think, be doing development to achieve development objectives because that's a good in and of itself. It doesn't have to have a security benefit for development, I think, to be a good thing to be doing. I mean, and also, I'm not saying I don't think the military should be doing it, as many humanitarians would. I think in terms of humanitarian work, there's, I think, an important room for distinction. But in terms of development, I think insecurity is the #1 issue in Afghanistan. If our aid projects have a significant benefit in addressing insecurity, I don't have a problem with using aid to address it, because that's the #1 priority of Afghans. However, if there's very limited evidence that our aid projects are actually addressing security, then maybe we should use our aid to address development and humanitarian development objectives, and not be spending so much money trying to pursue security, especially when I think there's this growing evidence that it's actually destabilizing. Yeah. So.
Expand a little bit on what you mean by governance and rule of law.
Yeah. In terms of the recommendations, I mean, this came up again as, I mean, the #1 cause of insecurity was the perception of in the regions we were doing research was bad government. And you know, the corruption of the government, again, the behavior of the police, and you know, people's feeling that, you know, they're, you know, without an effective government in place, you know, the Taliban are beginning to offer a better alternative in some areas and setting up parallel government structures. I mean, it's been reported, you know, the ombudsman, you know, if you have a complaint about the local Taliban, you can go register a complaint. Now, this has been reported. I don't know, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this, but on the government side, again, the perception that the government is, again, a cause of predation and insecurity is, I think, again, from the interviews we're having, is viewed as the #1 cause of insecurity. And so I think without being able to address the governance and rule of law piece, I see little hope for progress in the Afghan context. And then I think this is where I'm, you know, it's a somewhat separate presentation, but quite skeptical about ways forward that without a government partner is actually interested in the governance and rule of law piece. I'm not quite sure where we go from now, because I think that is the critical piece in terms of bringing some level of improvements in security in Afghanistan.
There's a tremendous amount of money that's being spent on the rule of law piece through the programs there, but that's not translating, at least.
It isn't, and I think for a number of reasons. One is because developing a judicial system is not something that's going to happen within the time frames which we say we have to have success in Afghanistan. I think we are very interested in it, and we're funding a lot of money, but do we have a partner in the government who's really interested in an effective rule of law? I think that's part of the problem now, is you could argue that many of the current leadership have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I mean, the status quo is working quite well for many people in government today. So I think we're interested, I think Afghan people are interested in an effective justice system, but we've not seen, I think, much evidence yet that the major investments made in the rule of law sector are paying out in terms of significant improvements. And I point to the police as an example of that, 'cause that's an area I've done research where, again, you could argue we ignored the police for too long for the first 5 or 6 years. But in the last several years, police have been a priority, and you know, billions have now been spent on training, equipping, building infrastructure for the police. And yet the perceptions of the police in Afghanistan today are not that much better than they were several years ago before our reform efforts. And I think partly because we treat these things as technical problems requiring more equipment and training and infrastructure, but you know, the police problem, and it's a political problem, and it requires political will at the top level to have the police functioning as a police force rather than as serving the political interests of the ruling elite. So I think that's where I'm skeptical. And I think relating it back to the 70s, we actually didn't have a whole lot of success then in terms of public administration reform, good governance, rule of law programming then. Sorry.
This was nicely counter-conventional. If somebody said, before I came into this, would I expect that you would say that the magnitude is not what we expect? I would say, that's what I let you say. Somebody said you were going to say not the magnitude is inadequate, the sign is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's really an interesting proposition. Because if you're true that the sign is wrong, not just the magnitude is much lower,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe we should stop it.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if the sign is wrong, then perhaps the whole concept is basic of counterinsurgency, which is force for security and then aid for hearts and minds. If that's wrong, the sign is wrong, then you need a much more profound rethinking than if it's just the magnitude is inadequate.
Yeah.
And so I know nothing about this, but one possibility would be to say, okay, if the sign is wrong, then maybe a different strategy would be a counterinsurgency without aid, but simply paying people to address the unemployment problem, so-called rent and tolerance, and that might be more effective than what you're doing. Would you take your conclusions about the sign being wrong that far?
I think I would take them close because we really found a remarkable lack of evidence. It's not, you know, we go to PRTs, and our methodology at the PRTs is tell us your success stories because we really want to learn from those and try to see what made this successful. But we haven't really come across success stories, and so, which makes that methodology somewhat, you know, difficult to pursue. And the reason often is, oh, it's too early to tell. And because the record keeping at the PRTs has been so abysmal, you know, we had a fantastic PRT working in Paktia the last 9 months, where I spent a lot of my time with there 4 times this year doing research, and very cooperative. But basically, the PRT commander was sort of begging me, if you can find out what the previous PRTs did here, please let me know, you know, because there's an inability to look back historically on what's been done. So one problem it could be that there's just bad record keeping. But there isn't an ability amongst the PRTs, and this is, the PRTs are the main players here in terms of expenditure, but a lot of the development actors too, in terms of showing impact. We have lots of USAID programs that have a stated objective of stabilization, but again, they also can't demonstrate impact, and partly because it's difficult to prove causality, probably impossible. But to answer your question, I'm stunned by the extent to which, when the stakes are so high in Afghanistan, we have this counterinsurgency strategy about this is a pretty fundamental piece, that there isn't more questioning going on. I'm certainly not claiming this, as I say, this is preliminary evidence. Methodologies are, you know, have their, you know, serious flaws. It's very difficult to do research in depth in Afghanistan without flawed methodologies. So I'm very, you know, looking for someone to come out and, you know, prove this wrong. But we haven't come across research. There's another group in Ottawa. I was just a couple weeks doing research in the Northeast and coming up with similar findings. So at a minimum, I would think that senior policymakers should at least be a lot more questioning than they are of this assumption. And what we find is at the field level, at the PRT level, a lot of the people have the same questions. They said there isn't a strategy. We're out there. We're being more and more, like chickens with our heads cut off was the wording of one, trying to go out, find more projects to fund, because their measurement of success is how much money they can spend, and that's what they're evaluated on. But there's no strategy behind that. There's no impact. And so the problem, I think, was not convincing people at that level. It's when you get to the Washington level that this is just accepted as gospel truth with limited evidence. And that's where I'm still surprised by that. But in answer to your question, is it more than a magnitude problem? I think it is. Yeah.
I don't have an extensive research background, as do you have, and the way you have done your research, I totally agree and respect for that. But based on my personal experience working for the United Nations for 2 years and growing up in Afghanistan and being there, as far as I remember, where we used to work with the UN, for us the safest group that we could go to the 5 regions that our office was involved were the PRT groups, because they really had a positive respect or great respect in the local area. And would you suggest that one reason why the aid was not that effective because prioritizing or identifying an effective project was not done in the past? Meaning, I do remember in one of the trips that I made to Pakistan that there was a school made by PRT group, and we went there, and it was a beautiful school, really beautiful, but there were no students, no teachers. So literally, in order to go to the school, you had to cross the river and then go to the school, while there was no bridge to cross the river, but you had to go to the school, and the school, there were no teachers and no professors. So my main question at that time was like, why not building the bridge first and then coming and building the school? So, and you really pointed that out, that the effectiveness of the aid in the higher level is how much money you spend rather than how good you do. Because, and the same thing, I did this summer research, a consultancy for Dutch government, and one of the things that we came across was with the USAID projects, where first, all the projects should be given to the US companies, and secondly, you have to spend the money, that's it.
Yeah.
And I think, because my fear with the research is that because usually the audience in the US will take it as in a way that aid is not effective in Afghanistan, so we should not spend our taxes anymore there. What, for me, being there, I really have the fear. I say, no, this is not right, because I'm coming from there, and it really hurts me, because if the money is not coming, I know where the direction of my country would be.
Yeah, no, I think very good, very good points there. You could argue that, yes, the problem is that we do development bad, and so therefore there hasn't been an impact. But I actually think it's more where we've done development good, done it well. It's also had, there's not evidence of stabilization impact. So again, and the National Solidarity Program was relatively well perceived compared to other programs. But that there was not evidence that where NSP was working were more secure as a result of that program. People liked the program better. So I don't think it's just a quality issue. On the quantity one, I think there is a risk that people say, oh, well, it doesn't have an impact, let's stop development. I'm not saying, however, I'm saying that we should be doing development, because doing development is a good in and of itself, even if it doesn't have a security benefit. Now, I know that's a message that could get lost in Washington, which is why many development agencies are the ones most opposed to what I have to say, much more so than many of the military people I talk to, because, yeah, they get a lot of money because of the assumption that there's a security benefit. However, this big is not better, I think is one of the lessons that recommendations I do have coming out of this research, which is that it's instructive to me that the one program that's relatively popularly perceived as NSP, which has generally $27,000 as the block grant. To me, that's a digestible, absorbable amount of money at a village level in Afghanistan that an agency that knows about development can manage and oversee and work with a community. Once you get into the millions and tens of millions and $100 million contracts, it becomes a faceless bidding process of RFPs and sealed contracts, and maybe not as sealed as they should be, but contracts are awarded, they're then flipping the contracts, they're sold down the chain. In Rosgan, we saw one contractor where the initial contract had been sold 5 times, and the amount that they were left up with was not nearly enough to do the project, which led to a low-quality project. The point being is that I think those large amounts of money in the Afghan context, I think, are often inappropriate for the current state of where Afghanistan is, for the current levels of insecurity. I'm also not saying there's no room for infrastructure projects in Afghanistan. I think where it makes sense to do a big infrastructure project and you can ensure quality and accountability, do it. But I am saying that in the south and southeast, some of these provinces, we are trying to spend far too much money given the absorptive capacity. And when I see CERP budgets increasing from 700 million to 1.2 billion next year, to me that's going to fuel insecurity more than it is security. So those are some of my concerns.
Just a quick
Yeah.
Can we argue because the reason NSP is very successful because of the way they are working out the structure of the NSP, meaning the involvement of the community, not the level of, like, the amount of money or donation that was given to them, the $27,000.
It could be, again, and it could be both. I would argue that the process is as important as the product in some of these things. Yeah, sorry.
Could you comment a bit on the question of employment generation? Because it would seem that even though it might not be conducive to security, big investment projects would be conducive to more employment. So how do the figures in terms of a big or investment in say in projects generating and employment generating projects, how does that fit into the picture in terms of impact?
Well, again, as I said, I mean, the employment issue comes up again in a lot of the interviews. It's a very important issue. A lot of interviewees want more factories because they provide employment. I mean, again, the issue of what factories would produce, where they would have a comparative advantage, none of that is addressed, but they want factories. And partly this is also, I think, there's a bit of a Soviet-era mentality in terms of collective farms and factories, and people are reminiscing about that period where employment was provided by some of these institutions that didn't produce anything that could be sold, but did provide employment. So I think it is a very important issue. But you know, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. You know, probably in our lifetimes, unfortunately, it's going to be one of the poorest countries in the world. If unemployment is one of the major factors driving insurgency, then I think we have a real serious problem in our hands, because we don't have the capacity to build a full employment economy in Afghanistan. There's reasons why Afghanistan are poor, which are beyond our capacity to address. So for these projects will provide employment, these cash for work programs on a road for 3 months. Or 3 weeks, or even 8 months. But this isn't a long-term sustainable job creation program. And in a way, that's maybe one of the criticisms, is no one's thinking about a long-term economy in Afghanistan that's going to sustain all these institutions where we want to double the size of the army, and let's double the size of the police, and let's create all these levels of elections and levels of government and decentralized. But where's the money going to come to pay for this highly complex set of institutions and large institutions that we're creating? But anyway, so again, it is a critically important issue, but I don't think it's one realistically that we're going to be able to address. And again, Afghanistan's been poor for a long time without, insurgents, and so I think this assumption that this is one of the main driving things I would question. Yeah.
Have you been able to talk with any of the PRTs from Iraq? Because that seems like if you were able to compare and contrast their experience, if they do have success stories there, that you could say the problems are localized to Afghanistan and not within the theory of counterinsurgency itself.
I actually haven't, because I've been very focused on Afghanistan. I should say we are doing one case study in the Horn of Africa, where the Joint Task Force Horn of Africa has been doing sort of hearts and minds projects along the Somali border in northeast Kenya. So that case study should be ready in the next month. But we haven't done Iraq. Ironically, when the project was first conceived, it sounded too dangerous to do research in Iraq, and Afghanistan seemed much more straightforward. But But it's a good point. I think there has been some attempts to look, but the results are somewhat disputed. Again, because the data, again, trying to prove causality is really next to impossible. But I think good qualitative research in some ways in these contexts would be more instructive, but I don't think that was really done. Sorry, there's someone in the very back.
Yes, I just have a couple of questions putting together a few of your comments. I appreciated, to be clear, I don't work in Afghanistan.
Okay.
I'm not really familiar with the case, so this is sort of a genuine question. Your points, I think, in terms of the sort of problems that you identified for the coalition and the government forces trying to provide development assistance were well taken. My question is then, are there ways in which the rival political authorities have managed to solve those problems? So like you mentioned, corruption, competition, sort of perverse incentives. So are the Taliban, the warlords, are there things that they are better at solving those issues than we are? Or is it that they operate just in a separate paradigm and the things that they're providing are simply not the things that we would consider because we have a sort of, either a Bavarian or a Westphalian mindset or whatever, these don't occur to us. So if you could just comment on which one of those you think it is and then maybe a little bit within
Yeah, I don't think that there are any other sort of warlords are offering much that Afghan public really want as an alternative. I think the Taliban, however, in some areas do generate support, and I think it's hard to know exactly why. I mean, there, as was pointed out, there's an intimidation factor, and there's a lot of hedging of bets going on. If you think the Taliban are going to win and take over, you want to make sure one foot is in that camp. But I think there is a genuine sense in some areas where, and I was working in Afghanistan in the 90s when the Taliban took over, and I was the director of Save the Children, and our staff in our Kabul office, 50% of whom were women, were very happy when the Taliban took over because they were so fed up with the anarchic situation that preceded that. And so, again, there is a memory that the Taliban brought stability. And for some, I think maybe more in, say, rural Pashtun areas, maybe a perception that they brought more in terms of justice, that they had courts that delivered quick and speedy justice. Now, we might not like the niceties there, but it was perceived to be more effective than, say, a government court system where you basically have to pay bribes, and whoever is the richest and most powerful person is always going to win in those courts. And so I think that perception of injustice and the perceptions of security are much more important in terms of state legitimacy than, again, the delivery of social services or reconstruction and aid programs. And I think this is our dilemma, which is, again, related to this last point, is it's much easier to deal with the social services and development piece than it is to deal with the justice and security piece. And that's what we have failed to deliver. And I think, for me, that's what's given momentum to the insurgency, because that's, to some extent, at least in some of the areas, is what the Taliban offer much more than the government offers. Yeah, sorry.
You have to tell me whether I'm completely out of my mind, but I'm wondering whether...
You're not.
Whether conceivable to think the insurgent or the Taliban as a development actors and the infrastructure project and this kind of thing can partially, probably run by Taliban's friendly groups or contractors or something like that. So, because there's experience, we did some experience and exercise on this issue in other parts of the world, trying to co-opt insurgents by offering them a possibility to become or involved to win a certain project that we are running. So I'm wondering whether it's conceivable to think that in the context of Afghanistan.
Sorry, in terms of like involving them in a political reconciliation process?
Involving Taliban even in the development project.
As I said, I think they are quite involved already in terms of being paid not to cause insecurity in that context. And as I said before, in some areas, it's not very clear what you mean what is a Talib and what are Taliban. And lines are much more blurred than I think is sometimes portrayed. You know, some people are Taliban for ideological reasons, some people are Taliban for tribal reasons, some people are there for criminal reasons, you know. And there's a lot of different motivations behind why people join. So, but, you know, I think more broadly in terms of the political reconciliation process, I think it is important to, for that process to move forward. I think that's the critical piece if we're ever going to move forward in Afghanistan, is for that political reconciliation piece to gain momentum. However, I'm somewhat skeptical that it will, because the only people who seem to be very interested in that right now seems to be the international community. We're really interested in political reconciliation now, but the Afghan government doesn't seem terribly interested in that, and the Taliban, who feel that they're doing pretty well right now, I think don't feel like what are the incentives for them to be involved in political reconciliation. But specifically on the development piece, I don't know, other than this informal examples of where I mentioned, I don't know of examples of where they've been more formally involved, but maybe others do. So, yeah. Hi, good to see you again.
A lot of what you said today resonated a lot with me, and some things I saw over the summer. I had a question, though, regarding what you said. You had mentioned that you found it difficult, if not impossible, to find an instance of a success story with PRT. And I just wondered what you thought of David Kilcullen's case study of Konar province in The Accidental Guerrilla.
Yeah.
And I can think of plenty of reasons why that might be flawed, but he's at least convinced himself that, at least for a certain period of time, this was an example of a successful project that brought about security benefits and the whole confluence of political lines of effort and economic lines of effort and security lines of effort, yielding beautiful outcomes, at least in the short term.
Yeah, well, again, I think that to me is the time frame, because, you know, I'd love to go do research in Kunar, but it's not an easy place to do research because it's so unstable. And all those, the benefits of those road building projects, last summer, or the summer before, I forget exactly, I think it was the summer before, but anyway, it's hard to really see what those stabilization benefits have been now. So I think there's a sustainability of impact issue that maybe if you have a massive program for those 3 months when you're actually employing everyone on the road building project, maybe that has a benefit in an area where the insurgents are locally homegrown, but in Paktia, where many of them are coming across the border, then providing local employment doesn't necessarily address that conflict dynamic. So I wouldn't rule out that that's had some benefit. I think David might be a bit more cautious about how successful that was a year down the road. There is this pattern of last year's success story being this year's disaster. Khost was a real success story a couple years ago, and it's, you know, not perceived to be that stable now. So again, there's an issue of how sustainable these effects are, but yeah.
Might that indicate, so if there are at least certain places where certain kinds of projects are successful to a degree for a certain period of time, could that indicate that in those places the shortcoming is the shortcoming may be the amount of aid? In other words, the amount of aid and the way it's conceived, that we're thinking about it in too short a term, not able to develop kind of a compounding snowball effect where one project feeds into and supports another follow-on project, and they kind of flow seamlessly together. And that if there's more of it, thinking in the longer term, in some places it might.
No, it could be. And as I said, you know, we've done research in 5 provinces. There's 29 other ones out there where there could be these success stories. And so I think that's why I would think people should be investing in trying to understand this better and finding those success stories and learning from them. But I have interviewed others who have worked in Kunar who are a lot more pessimistic about, in terms of their analysis of how successful those programs were. Also people who were based in Nuristan. So I have heard anecdotally, but you know, to me it's, what are the drivers of conflict in a certain area? If it's really that the conflict is because of, again, this water dispute, if you can really address that, okay, I would, you know, think that there could be stability benefits. And our research here, I'm talking about Afghanistan, I have no question that in some other contexts where you have conflict, some development programs can address that. I'm not making generalizations from Afghanistan globally, but in Afghanistan, my understanding of the Taliban-led insurgency And Kunar, you maybe have more Hizbi aspects, and you have Haqqani network and Pakti. I mean, different groups, but that poverty is not a major driver of the insurgency in Afghanistan. And as I said before, it's a lot of these other factors. Pakistan's geopolitical ambitions might be one factor. There's an ideological dimension for some. There's the tribal. There's the drug economy. A whole range of factors that our development programs, again, I think are important, but they're not addressing the conflict drivers. And I don't know Kunar, and I've actually, if we were to do one more province in Afghanistan, Kunar is top on our list precisely because it's perceived as a success story, and we want to find them. So, yeah.
You make a really, really compelling argument. One of the things sort of from
But no one believes me.
But from one of the things from a development perspective that's sort of a little unfortunate is that the measure of effectiveness of aid is its contribution to security, right? And I mean, although you say development for development's sake is also important, and I'm wondering sort of from the angle of development actors, is there a point to try and disconnect and disentangle the development and security concerns?
Yeah, absolutely, from my perspective. I think a lot of this research came out of interest living in Afghanistan from 2002, 2005, and doing lots of research there subsequently, and getting very actually tired of the debate, civil-military debates between the humanitarians and the military, and this blurring of lines and shrinking of humanitarian space. And again, I think there's some very good arguments there, but they're not arguments that I think will have an impact in a place like Washington. If you have humanitarian principles on one hand and you have national security interests in the other, one is always going to win and one is always going to lose. So I'm somewhat critical of some of the NGO actors on that front, because, in terms of not necessarily being strategic on that. And for me, a more interesting argument is from an aid effectiveness angle. And as I said in the beginning, most of the aid effectiveness debate, for some reason, gets restricted to aid's effectiveness in the humanitarian and development realm. And yet, when an increasingly percentage of development aid, certainly in the U.S. is, and certainly in a country like Afghanistan, is spent explicitly to achieve stabilization and security objectives, at a minimum, we should test its effectiveness in that area as we do in humanitarian development. And that's what's not being done. And that's my complaint amongst policymakers, but also development actors, because development actors often don't want that disconnect to be made because it gets them a seat at the table. So I can understand in Washington, again, development for development's sake is all very nice and well, but it doesn't always get you a seat at the table. So if you can say what we do is in the national security interests of America, that's tactically, I think I can understand why it's done. However, someday, if this trend continues, people could say, well, these NGOs are a waste of space because, they don't achieve they have no demonstrated impact in achieving these stabilization and security objectives, which they say they are better at than the military. And so I do think that the development community should be a bit more concerned about these issues. On the other hand, I understand in the short term why there's a reluctance to do so.